Hello guys, in this video we are going to study the principles behind the Ruy Lopez or the Spanish opening. The Spanish opening goes like this. It starts with e4, black responds with e5, knight f3 is the second move of white, knight c6, and then bishop to b5. So what are the principles behind this opening? First, it is a battle for central control, okay? So by moving the knight to f3 on the second move, white is actually threatening to capture the pawn on e5. And black defends that pawn by moving the knight to c6. And white tries to undermine that by threatening to capture the knight on c6. So bishop to b5 threatens to capture the knight on c6. So that is the basic, those are the basic moves, opening moves of the Ruy Lopez. And the following moves or the responses, different responses from black determines the variation. So let us analyze and study all the possible variations depending on the different responses of black to bishop to b5. Okay, so the most common one is a6, which is the Morphy defense. Okay, the next most common one is bishop to c5, which is the classical defense, Ruy Lopez classical defense. Another one is d6, which is the old Steinitz defense. Another option for black here is bishop to b4, which is the Alapin defense. Another option here for black is bishop to e7, which is the Lucena variation. And another one is knight to f6, which is the Berlin defense. Ruy Lopez opening Berlin defense. Or black can try knight to e7, which is the Cosio defense. And there is an option to fianchetto the bishop on g7 by moving the pawn to g6, which is the fianchetto defense. Ruy Lopez opening fianchetto defense. All right. And another one which can be done is b6, which is the rotary Albany gambit. And also there's a counter gambit here which is d5. Okay, so this is called the Ruy Lopez opening Spanish counter gambit, which is quite risky for black. Okay, but those are the different responses of black to bishop to b5. Okay, so let us see the main line first. The main line here, or the most popular line here, is the Morphy defense. So after a6, kicking away the bishop on b5, bishop a4 is the best move. And then black tries something like knight f6, threatening to capture the pawn on e4. Now, white can castle. Okay, maybe you're thinking, oh, the knight can capture the pawn. This is somewhat a poisoned pawn. Okay, a poisoned pawn means it appears to be free, which it is. It is really free. Black can capture that, but the problem is, it will pose some difficulties in the position, or difficulties in defending, because after d4, for example, maybe you're thinking, oh, that's free. I think, is it? It's not free, because if you're thinking of capturing it with the e pawn, then that will be a problem for black because of this pin. Once the rook moves to e1, pinning the knight, then it will be harder for black to defend its position, because after, say, bishop to c5, and now the bishop can capture here. B takes c6, and now white can win this knight because it's pinned at the moment, and the knight cannot move because the king will be open to the check. All right, so that's the problem with capturing that pawn. So after castling, what's the best move here for black? Yeah, actually that's the main line there. Knight takes e4 and d4, but black should not capture the pawn. It will be a bad move. So the best move here is to push the pawn to b5, driving away the bishop, and now push the pawn to d5, and black has a strong center pawns, has strong center occupancy, right? So that is the Morphy defense. All right. Now, what happens if after a6, for example, white tries something like bishop takes c6, and this is called the exchange variation of the Morphy defense. Ruy Lopez opening, Morphy defense, exchange variation. So if you are to capture, what are you going to use to capture the bishop? Well, the best option here is to capture with the pawn. Okay, pawn on d7. Why? Because it opens the line for the bishop to be active immediately. All right. Well, there is a saying that you should capture towards the center. Okay, but it's not always the case, because you must also consider your pawn islands. Pawn islands means the groups of connected pawns, or the groups of pawns that can be connected. Okay, so if you capture with the b pawn, you're actually separating the a6 pawn from the pawn island. All right, so once white captures that pawn, black has 3 pawn islands. All right, and theoretically that is not good for endgame. All right, so the best option here is to capture with the d pawn. Okay, so it will result to only 2 pawn islands. Okay, the wing pawns on the queen side and the wing pawns on the king side, and it also opens the line for the bishop to go out and be active. All right, so in the exchange variation, knight c3 will be the next move for white here, and then f6 defends the pawn on e5, and now d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to d7, and after this the position is equal. Okay, the position is equal. So the exchange variation is not so good, not very good for white. Okay, so that is why the most popular line after a6 in the Morphy defense is bishop to a4, avoiding the early trade of the bishop for the knight. Okay, next, what if black tries to move the bishop to c5? So we have this classical defense of the Ruy Lopez. So the next moves here, the best moves will be c3, knight f6, d4, e takes d4, and then maybe castles, or maybe white can push the pawn actually. All right, and then knight to d5, castles, bishop to e7, knight takes d4, castles. So after the series of some exchange here of the pawns, white has a slight advantage after this. So this variation, the bishop to c4 option, is not so bishop c5 variation, which is the central variation, classical central variation, it's not so promising for black, because after c3 prepares to push the pawn to d4, okay? And after that, the bishop will be just forced to retreat. You know why? Because, for example, if white tries to, or maybe let's say, if black tries to castle, for example, you see that the c pawn can capture the d4 square, the d4 pawn, and now the bishop will need to move, okay? So bishop to e7 is the best square for that bishop. So it's bishop c5 is like a wasted move because of the fact that white can just simply prepare for the push by moving the pawn to c3, okay? And it can drive away that bishop on c5 later in the game. All right? So that's bishop c5. Now, what if black tries bishop to b4, pinning this pawn, pinning the pawn, okay, against the king? So again, for this variation, c3, and now the bishop can go to a5, and the tricky move here for white is knight to a3, okay? So knight to a3, there's a saying that the knight on the rim is grim, right? Which means that if you do not place your knight on the side or the edge of the board, because it can only occupy half of its scope, okay? Because the knight at the edge of the board is not really good, but this is an exception. This is the best move here in this position. Why? Because it prepares for knight to c4, or maybe knight to c2 on the next moves, okay? Now bishop to b6, and then now knight c4, okay? Knight c4, then d6, and then d4, e takes d4, knight takes b6, a takes b6, c takes d4. And after the series of exchange, we can see that white has a stronger center, because the pawns on the center are still intact and occupying more squares, okay? So that's the way to respond to the Alapin defense, which is bishop to b4, okay? So bishop to b5, bishop to b4, bishop to b5, then bishop to b4, and the best move here is c3, driving away the bishop, and then knight a3 to prepare for the exchange. If ever the bishop goes to b6, then prepare for the push and something like that. So ultimately, the idea is to prepare for d4, okay? So that is the main idea here for white, okay? Whatever black tries to do here, the idea is to open up the center, open the center. And how is white going to achieve that? By pushing the pawn to d4. But if there are pieces like bishop, then on c5, then white must prepare for that first by moving the to c3. Okay, but if black tries to delay d4 by pinning the pawn, then again c3, okay, is the best move. Okay, what about bishop to e7, the Lucena variation? So the next move here will be knight to c3, okay, because bishop to e7 is quite passive, and that allows white to develop the knight to c3, and then knight f6, castles, d6, and now d4. E takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to d7, and then a4, a6, bishop to c4, castles, and the position is somewhat equal, right? The position is somewhat equal, and bishop e7 is safe for black. It is passive, but it's not aggressive, and which means that it is safer, but also that the bishop is somewhat limited in the e7 square, because the pawn on d6 is covering its scope along this diagonal. But that's an option. Bishop to e7 is an option, okay, and it's not a bad move. It's actually safe. Okay, bishop to b5. Let's see that again. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. So we see bishop e7, the Lucena variation. Now, how about knight f6? Knight f6 is the Berlin defense. So after the move knight f6, the best move will be to castle. What about knight takes e4? What are you going to do after knight takes e4? Then rook to e1 is the best move here. So after knight to d6, threatening to capture on the bishop, bishop to f1 is the best move here. Now f6, defending that pawn on e4. Then d4, adding the attacker to that pawn. And then knight f7, defending that pawn. Now knight c3, d6, adding defense to that pawn. And in this position, black is has a little edge here, okay, after the series of exchange. So allowing the knight to capture on e4 is not a good idea. Well, that's a variation, but you can actually allow that, because after rook to e1, knight to d6, there are other options here actually. And one of the options is bishop to f1, but knight to e4 is also a strong option here. Okay, black cannot capture the bishop anyway. You know why? Because knight takes c6, check. It's a discovered attack, and at the same time attacks the queen, right? So if black tries to cover with the bishop, then knight takes, bishop takes, or king takes, okay? So the queen will go away if black tries to capture the bishop. What else? For example, if bishop to e7, then now bishop to e1, and now we can see that the position is somewhat equal, but white has a little edge, because the white's rook here on e file is controlling the open file. Okay, and this bishop here on f1 is preparing to be fianchettoed here later, or maybe it can still control this diagonal here, and then the knight and the bishop can develop later, and that is strong for white. Okay, so that's the idea behind letting the pawn capture on e4, because the rook will be really strong along this e file. Okay, now what about after bishop to b5, black tries something like knight to e7. So after knight to e7, white can just simply continue developing. Okay, knight to g6, adding the defender to that pawn, and now d4 is possible. After e takes d4, knight takes d4, and then bishop to c5, attacking the knight, and then knight to f5 is an option here, and then castles. So this knight outpost here is really strong. Now bishop to e3, bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, knight c to e7, bishop to d3, then d6. So the position is somewhat equal. Okay, and in the middle game in this variation. All right, and so we see that the Kosho defense is a safe option as well. It's a safe option. So, and there's another line here, which is not knight g6, but g6 to fianchetto the bishop on g7. That's also an option in this position. But the main line would be, actually there are lots of different options here for black. So knight e7 is not bad. Okay, it's a safe move because it prepares to recapture in case the bishop on b5 captures on the knight on c6 to avoid double pawns. Okay, so a6 is also an option here for black, and just depending on the next moves from each side, then it boils down to how tactical and strategic the player will be in the next moves. Okay, so those are some of the basic variations after bishop to b5. So that's the Ruy Lopez, or the Spanish opening. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. So there are other lines here that you can explore, and you can try using the Spanish opening in your games and see how it goes. And I hope you learned something from this video. Thank you.